Thank you, everybody, for joining. I think we're just going to wait a minute to make sure that we've got everybody who wanted to join us in the meeting. But you are in the right place if you're looking for the UK election mission final report launch from the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. So we'll just wait an extra minute while we allow people to join, and then we will get going. Okay, it looks like the numbers are creeping up. It looks like that we have a good amount of people online with us today. You're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us for this election mission report from the UK General Election 2024. I'm Sarah Dixon. I'm going to be facilitating this meeting, and I'm also the Chief Executive of the UK branch of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and the Regional Secretary for the British Islands and Mediterranean region of that same association. And we're the ones that organised this assessment mission, inviting people from across the Commonwealth, from parliaments across the Commonwealth, to come and see what the UK general election had to hold. The association normally brings parliamentarians from across the Commonwealth together to talk about policy issues, to talk about what it's like to be parliamentarians, and to work together. And we've been doing election work, supporting democracy since 2010. We've done over 20 election observation missions across the Commonwealth, in UK overseas territories and Crown dependencies principally. And we've also observed previous UK elections in 2015 and 2017. A couple of points of housekeeping just while we're preparing and before we get going with the conversation about the report. The first is, you probably noticed on your screen that the webinar will be recorded, and there'll also be screenshots taken during the proceedings, which may be used in our communications. There's a Q&A function. You'll see, again, hopefully if you're used to Teams, you'll be used to this, but there's a Q&A function which you can use to write questions, to give your comments. And my colleague, Martin Vickery, will be looking at those throughout the webinar, and we'll come to them once we've given an initial presentation about the launch. And then I should introduce the panel members that I have with me here today. The first of them is our head of mission. Every election observation has a head of mission, and ours is the Honourable Otiende Omolo. He's a member of the National Assembly in Kenya, formerly the Ombudsman for Kenya, and previously served as one of the 9 experts who drafted the Constitution of Kenya. An accomplished advocate, and served on a number of election observation missions previously, and is joining us online from Nairobi. So thank you very much, Honourable Omolo, for leading this mission and joining us for the report launch. We also have online our two... Sorry.
I was just saying I'm glad to join. Thank you very much. Glad to join.
We've got a little feedback on your connection, Honourable Omolo. I might ask my colleagues Martin and Salsabil to see if they can work out why that might be. I can see there's a double joining. I've got your name twice, so there may be something in that that's making it a little feedback. But while I'm introducing the analysts, hopefully my colleagues can have a look at that and see if we can make the sound a little better. Our analysts, our experts, are Dr. Stefan Shred, who's a visiting fellow at Harriman Institute at Columbia University and regularly served as a consultant on election observation missions around the world. You're very welcome, Stefan. And Vasil Vaschanka, a researcher at the Radboud University in the Netherlands, focusing on corruption and political finance. Participated in over 20 election missions around the world. And today we're going to draw on the findings from the General Election Assessment Mission report to consider the question, which is, how can the UK improve its electoral process? So we will be looking in that critical analytical way at our findings and what we think could be improved. Honourable Omolo, I think as our head of mission, I'd like to start by asking you a question. For those who weren't with us here in July, can you tell us a bit about what an election mission is and what happened in July. So over to you, first of all.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope the sound has improved. There seems to still be an issue. Can you hear me?
It's better.
Yes. Good. Thank you very much. Well, essentially, election missions are about impartial and independent observation of an election. In this case, we were observing the elections in the UK, and by the grace of the UK CPA team, we were able to travel from 29th of June up to 6th of July, observing the elections essentially on election day, which was 4th of July. The team comprised 29 members of parliament from 16 different jurisdictions, and we were in the UK for at least 1 week. Before elections, we underwent an intense training for 2 days, where we interacted with the UK system, with the law, and a variety of things. We were also able to engage with civil society groups, with some candidates, and with elections officials well before that. Once we were trained and come election day, we were deployed all across the country, both to rural areas and urban areas, and we were able to observe elections in at least 8 different constituencies. In terms of the polling stations, we did almost 300 polling stations, so the observation was essentially quite wide. On election day, we made sure that during the opening of the ballot materials, we were in each and the respective polling stations. So essentially, we had to start as early as 5 a.m., some of us, to be present by 7 a.m. We sat through and visited various polling stations during the day, and we made sure that during closing, we were back to the very same stations where we had started. We were able to observe the counting, and so essentially, we shouldn't even be talking of election day because we observed the whole day. We observed closing and counting, which essentially brought us up to the next morning on the 8th of July. So it was quite intense. What I would say is that the report covers a lot of these things, but one essential feature that is different, I've observed elections in many countries, and if I compare it with many countries I've observed, even in Kenya, is the subtleness. You almost couldn't feel that there was an election. In many countries, including Kenya, preceding the elections, there would be rallies, drawing wide crowds, there would be billboards, there would be posters, there'd be a lot of other things. But as we later learned, it appears that in the UK, the electioneering was more online. And therefore, that's one feature that is quite different from many elections I've observed. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Yes, it did seem a little bit less obvious on the streets. But Stefan, can you tell us a little bit about why we would do an election mission? Is it a test? Is it a comparison? What's the kind of methodology?
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for having us, first of all. It's an absolute pleasure to be part of the process. And that is a great question. We often think of election observation as something of a test, kind of a pass or fail, thumbs up or thumbs down kind of exercise. But in fact, I think it's very important to underline that observation is not a test. As observers, we don't aim to provide a definitive response as to whether an election was free and fair or perhaps otherwise. But instead, what we do is we observe comprehensively across all stages of the process, that is, including well before election day, so all the stages that lead up to election day, with a view, first of all, whether the election process complies with domestic legislation. So in this case, we're talking about UK laws and regulations that are in place for UK elections. And second, whether the election meets international standards for democratic elections. And these are some of the public international human rights law instruments that have universal applications, so really global compacts, global applications, such as the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, or specific compacts on specific matters, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And this is when we look to women's participation. This would be the document that we would be looking at, which host countries, and here the UK, would have signed up to. But we also look at regional documents. And here in Europe, we have the European Convention on Human Rights, or even kind of political rather than legally binding commitments, such as those documents that have been adopted as part of the CSE process that later became the OSCE, Council of Europe's Code of Good Practice for Electoral Matters, and several others, all the way up to kind of soft instruments, such as guidance from some of the leading and reputed election observation bodies, such as the OSCE, such as the EU, but also indeed the CPA. Now, we don't compare elections. That's also an important point to underline. We don't do so either across time nor space. So we don't compare the 2024 elections in the UK against the process in 2019 or earlier, nor do we compare UK elections to those elections in other countries. So we focus really exclusively on the two measuring sticks that I've already mentioned, and that is both the domestic law and international standard. Now, it's also important, I think, to underline that we are not overseers and we are not election police. We're very much observers, remain impartial and independent in our role. We collect information, we find facts, engage in fact-finding. We meet with all relevant stakeholders across the different levels. So this would be the national, the regional, and local level. And we observe firsthand observation, and we make a clear distinction when it is firsthand observation versus collecting information from interlocutors, hearing their views. And that is, kind of second-hand information, if you will, from our interlocutors. We weigh this, process it, triangulate across different sources that we come across to assess all or some parts of the process. And these findings and conclusions are then made public through our external reporting, first through the preliminary statement that we already published on the day after the election, so that's the 5th July, and then again with a little bit more detail in the final report that we are launching today.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And Vasil, perhaps I'd like to bring you in at this stage because we sent 29 parliamentarians and dozens of staff across the country. But how are they able to collect data and then make recommendations? How does that process work?
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity again. So as Stefan already mentioned, we really have started gathering information even before we arrived. So obviously there's a certain amount of research we have done before we even landed. And when we did land, we tried to hit the ground running. So after the briefing, our teams have gone to the constituencies and had a series of meetings with various interlocutors. I think we were very fortunate. We covered the election administrators. We were able to meet with the political actors, with candidates, with their campaign staff, and certainly some civil society that were there were also happy to share with us. So on the basis of all this, really, we are able to say something about the pre-election period. And then on election day, we, I think, have had a very good effort, and we really, all our teams from the early morning until very late in the day have basically been active out and about. We have visited over 260 polling stations. I think that gives us enough to offer, to stand on for our findings. Obviously, every mission is just a snapshot, and we cannot say that we have seen everything. We do not maintain that we offer, solid scientific evidence for every finding. But we did observe certain patterns, and I think it's fair to say that they're indicative of something, and they give us an opportunity to offer these recommendations in a constructive advisory manner to flag to the authorities that we were suggesting some issues could be considered and looked at further.
Thank you. So I think the big question really is for you, Honourable Omolo, which is, so what did we find out? Can you give us a sense of the overall findings of the mission, and then we'll go into the bit of the detail.
Thank you, Sarah. In summary, the overall finding was quite positive, and we were confident that the election results reflected the will of the people and this can be trusted. Obviously, as Vasil said, there were a few issues that were noted which will require consideration, but there are only a few issues. Overall, the results were trustworthy. There was almost universal praise for the election officials, the returning officers and those who ran the elections, and that was quite encouraging in terms of their impartiality, professionalism, and the ability basically to run an election. There was also significant and general praise for the various boundaries commission, because before the elections day, we had heard from various interlocutors that they were fearful that since there had been a delimitation exercise in recent times, it might interfere with the, with the election results. But as it turned out, it did not, and we were able to find that everyone was happy with the way the delimitation was done. In fact, when we later interacted with the commission, with the electoral commission, we were told that there had not been a single challenge to the newly created units, which I think is very good. But the defining word in the entire scope of the elections in the UK is essentially the word trust, and everyone seems to trust in the system.
Yes, I definitely remember hearing that word a lot as we were going through this process. And I think trust does seem to be a core part of the way the UK system works. But let's go into a bit of the detail now. Let's look at the things that we noted. You've mentioned one of them there already. And earlier you talked about how a lot of the campaign looked like it was proceeding online. And we also talk about in our report how there were incidents that candidates told us about of hostility or anger towards them. Can you tell us a bit about that? I mean, as a parliamentarian yourself, I'm sure you're quite well versed with these challenges that you face as elected representatives.
Yes, indeed. And I would say that the challenges we noted are of a smaller magnitude compared to some of the elections we've observed, or even elections in Kenya. I think some of the challenges revolve around the treatment of minorities, the treatment of women, and the LGBTQ community, and especially on the online platforms. And I think the report covers that at length. There was a specific incidence of hostility, and there were some candidates who complained that they had been accosted, during the campaign. In one particular instance, a candidate complained of being heckled to a point that they would not go for a campaign without police protection, and they sought police protection, to continue their, with their campaigns. But overall, we also noted a lot of efforts, especially from civil society and other actors, to address these challenges. And one of the mission recommendations actually covers this: the need to address concerns about violence, threats, and intimidation during, before elections and during elections. And I think that's covered quite well in the report.
Yes, thank you. And I think we've got online one of our observers who was supporting us, and obviously lots of our observers are also elected officials. I think we've got Deputy Heidi Soulsby online from the States Assembly in Guernsey. Is that right, Martin? Is she with us today?
So she may well have been called into States business, I believe.
Oh.
But we do have, so right now they sit at past. But we do have her question, if I could maybe possibly share on her behalf.
Thank you.
Which is, what did the mission find out about the experience of women candidates in the election campaign?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. We definitely spoke to some specialists on this. Stefan, would you like to elaborate on that?
Certainly, thank you very much. So looking to the progress achieved, the number of women who won seats on the 4th July, 263, is the highest ever in UK elections. And I think this is certainly something we can celebrate as an important milestone in the 2024 elections. The last legislative period, so the one starting in 2019 up to 2024, was already an important move forward. For the first time, we had over a third of the seats held by women MPs. Now we're above the figure of 40%. Now that may not be parity at 50-50 yet, but certainly the progress is notable, and that is of course to be celebrated. There is something of a paradox in this, however. Even before election day, we noted that on the one hand, we have the highest number of women standing in these elections overall. So there's never been so many women candidates in election. As a nominal figure, the overall figure. but their share as candidates, so the percentage as candidates, was down on the previous elections in 2019. I think that's really interesting because it does underline the fact that we should not become complacent, that work remains to be done. We are apolitical. We don't like to talk about results, but the high number of women that have won seats is in great measure down to the fact that it was the Labour Party that carried such a commanding majority in the results. And Labour was the party with the highest number of women candidates going into the elections, including the fact that they placed women in winnable constituencies. So it's not just about the number of women, but also where the women stood as candidates. So in other words, in order to sustain this high representation of women, there will be much more work needed to ensure that political parties, first of all, nominate women overall. They nominate a high number of women. They nominate women in winnable districts. And lastly, that women come forward to stand, whether this be as nominees of political parties, but also as independent candidates. So that's all important. And this is where I come to somewhat less kind of joyous reality. And this is the fact that many of our interlocutors were very highly concerned about harassment and some of the personal attacks, especially online, that have been endured by women candidates and some of the other underrepresented groups that have already been mentioned by Honorable Amalo. This is very concerning and may, of course, discourage women candidates from standing. And I think this is something we all saw as an issue that needs to be addressed. There may be other factors that inhibit women from standing. There could be questions of working conditions in the parliament, the ability to join the work of parliamentarians with childcare provisions and so forth. So there may be other aspects, but the issues of aggression, intimidation, pressure, and so forth are often both directed at women, but they can also be especially taxing for women and underrepresented groups. And this is something that really should be looked at more closely.
Yes, I think everything you've said there underlines the reason the report has a recommendation on diversity and inclusion. And with my other hat on, we've done a lot of work on addressing online abuse. And we've got a handbook, in fact, which I know that my colleagues can put a link to in the chat if that would be helpful to support parliamentarians in those situations of abuse and difficulty. And I know that diversity and inclusion across the board was something that came out, but we've focused a bit on the issue of women today in this webinar. But you'll see in the report that we talk about other kinds of diversity and inclusion as well for representation. Stefan, perhaps turning to the operation of the UK system itself, we heard a lot about how in the UK it's local and decentralised, as well as having a central electoral body. Local authorities play a role, and it is a bit something that our observers noticed because it's not the same in all countries that works. Can you orient us on the UK system and what were some of the areas where that local decentralised might pose some challenges?
Sure, thank you, Sarah. Indeed, so this is something that many of our observers remarked on just how decentralized the system is, and that really stands apart from many of the systems that many of us as observers live in, and operate in jurisdictions, either live and operate in or perhaps observe as well. In the UK, this is of course a function of two factors. First of all, and I think most importantly, the single mandate constituencies and the first past the post electoral system, where in fact we're looking at a single election to a single legislature, the Westminster, the UK Parliament, but in fact it is equally true to say that there are 650 different elections in the 650 constituencies that return the MPs. It's also a function of historical legacy, where democracy was an organic process in the UK, unlike in many of the other countries where it came as a foreign import, or at least how it was institutionalized, or was very much an elite-driven project driven from above. That's distinctive in the UK, and I think that's important to keep in mind. The elections in the UK are implemented at the constituency level first and foremost by the returning officers who are responsible for running the process and returning the elected MP to Parliament. The Electoral Commission is a regulatory body, an advisory body that was only established at the turn of the century or millennium, even if you will, 2001, that among others provides guidance at the national level, but election delivery is very much a decentralized process that takes place at the constituency level.
Yes, I mean, we definitely found that because we visited the constituencies. Can you talk a little bit more about the characteristics of this system? Because I know we had a recommendation that came out around how that balance between central and devolved lies.
Sure. So I think it's important to stress that at the local level, there is a very high level of trust in the returning officers and other election officials. And we've already talked about that, but I think it bears underlining also in this context, that trust is really very much a finding that we've come across all across the UK, what we've observed. There was almost kind of universal trust in the professionalism and impartiality of the people who were delivering elections at the constituency level. And again, this is something that is very much to be celebrated. It does mean that the process lacks certain national systems and mechanisms that one might expect. So for instance, voter registers are managed locally. So there's no really coordinated check across the UK to see if there may be multiple entries, multiple registrations of the same voters. That is an aspect that has come up in our conversations and our observations. There is no automatic check to see if a candidate is standing in multiple constituencies. And as we have mentioned in our report, and I think many of us have heard, radio reports, media, a case of an influencer, of a YouTube influencer, Nico Milana, who not only registered himself to stand in one constituency, incidentally where Rishi Sunak won the seat, but has also convinced 10 other people to change their name to his name, to Nico Milana, and then also run in 10 other constituencies. And it was really down to newspapers, asking questions, and then for the police to really investigate whether he himself stood in the 11 constituencies, whether he himself registered in those constituencies, which would have been against the law, or whether he really did manage to convince 10 other people to change their names. And this is something that arose from police investigation, rather than from kind of a centralized register of candidates to be able to know who those people were. So that's a bit of a sort of a missing link there that we've identified. There is also lack of data, at least some data about candidates who are standing. For example, there was no statutory body that could tell us how many women candidates were running in this election. It was kind of left to civil society organizations to do the legwork and then provide that data. We know from our experience as observers that good policy decisions are based on good information. There are deficits here that I think could be addressed with a view to both improving the administration of the process overall, but also to help inform policy making. We need good understanding of where those deficits occur. So a greater kind of coordination role for the Electoral Commission, greater gathering of information across all of the 650 constituencies may perhaps be helpful. And this is one of the recommendations that we make to the authorities, is to make the Electoral Commission have an increased role in collating and publishing some of the sets of data about candidates, such as the characteristics about them, for instance, number of women running and so forth.
Yes, thank you. And I think that goes to a couple of the questions in the chat about, do we have overall data and where that central data function might lie? And that's why I think we've made a recommendation on that. But so far, we haven't really talked about voting. So maybe we should get to the nub, Vasil, of talking a bit about voting and how that works. And possibly because it was in the media the most, let's start with postal voting, maybe a less traditional way of voting, but definitely on the increase. Can you talk to us a bit about this and what we observed?
Yes, well, I might as well start from the end of the story, where we do have a recommendation that there should be changes considered to postal voting, and maybe even other forms of voting should be considered as alternatives, because postal voting, as it is devised now, I think has a difficult time coping with the demand. I think the starting point there is that the time scale, the timeline for organizing elections is rather tight. It is devised in the law, I think, before postal voting really came to be what it is now. And it doesn't really accommodate postal voting, even in the country, with the demand surging as it has been in the recent elections, and certainly not abroad. So we have repeatedly heard complaints, concerns from people that I have received my ballot, it arrived so late. I don't know if there'll be time to for it to be returned in time to be counted. And this is not a new concern, and this was highlighted in previous reports. For people abroad, if they have to deal with international mail, it becomes an almost impossibility to receive the ballot on time and return it in time to be included in the count. So where we're coming from is that time scale, if it remains, needs to accommodate postal voting better, and there need to be other solutions found for returning the ballots, possibly for sending ballots, and possibly other forms of special voting arrangements, such as maybe early voting or other ways to cast ballot for people who are unable to do it on election day. So this is the gist of what we have to say about postal voting.
Yes, I thought it was really interesting in the polling stations I attended, how people were even coming with postal votes in their envelopes rather than posting them. So there must be something in that around how it works. And so that's why we made the recommendation. And we made another voting recommendation in the report to do with what's known as family voting and also kind of connected to ballot secrecy. Could you explain a bit about why we would need a recommendation on this?
Yes. Well, family voting, first of all, is a term we use it rather loosely. We use it for a situation where multiple people go into the same polling booth or sort of vote together, and they may or may not be family members. But what's happening there is that the ballot secrecy, unfortunately, is not upheld, and this is a pattern that we have observed again and again. I have to say, if I'm looking here, I think it was 17% of polling stations that we have looked at during election day. We noted that in some situations ballot secrecy was just not preserved. That doesn't mean that it was always the intention of anyone to disclose the how the person is voting, but the fact is that this is a rather high figure. I think gives us ground to offer some recommendations on this. Family voting was one of those situations. In other situations, we saw that the layout was such that the ballot is not really cast in secrecy because people can be seeing what inside the polling booth, or the polling booth is just too close to the table where the polling clerks are sitting. So a variety of situations where we saw that secrecy of the ballot was not upheld, and this has led to this particular recommendation.
Yes, thank you. And I mean, how serious is this? Can you put this into context for us? You know, is there something, you know, that we can do about that?
I think something is already being done about that, and what we were saying is that more can be done. This is obviously both on the voters and on the election administrators. So the secrecy of the ballot is a guarantee of the free expression of the voters' will, and it's a guarantee and a safeguard that nobody is trying to unduly influence the voters. So that's why it's important that it is upheld. There are actions that can be done on the part of election administration when it comes to instructing the voters, when it comes to planning the layout of the polling station, finding the premises that are adequate and that will support this in practice. But also it's on the voters to really understand why this is a necessary guarantee, why it is important to maintain it. And so this is why this recommendation is offered in that spirit of maintaining the standard that is really underpins the confidence in the electoral process in the UK.
Yes, that makes sense to me. It does sound very much like, you know, it's in the context of a well-run election where there's lots of trust in the authorities. And I think that's been a helpful, hopefully, for all our participants today, kind of outline of some of the things that we saw in this election assessment mission. But we've now got some time for some question and answers. I know we've got some Q&A already in the chat. Please do use the Q&A function. I believe there's also a chat function where you can post your questions. I do know that a couple of people had already asked in advance to ask some questions. Martin, is Ian Carter online? I understood he wanted to ask something about kind of the consistency across polling stations. Is Ian with us today?
Certainly is, and I'm just trying to re-find him in the list of people. Here we go. You are now allowed, Ian, to come on and answer your question, which follows on quite nicely from what we were just talking about the operation of voting. So,
am I there?
You're there. You're here.
Right.
We can hear you.
Just,
go ahead.
Good. Just really a question about the consistency of the application of the rules across polling stations. I was an observer and could see that presiding officers, some applied rules differently to others. Was there any feel with regard to that consistency across constituencies and obviously on a wider basis as to how rules within the polling station, which alludes back to, say, family voting, were applied?
Yes, that's a good point about consistency, because we did go to lots of different places. Stefan, would you like to take that one first of all?
Sure, thanks very much. So yes, that is a remark that we've heard from many of our observers that really came together nicely during the debriefing session. So the forums told us part of that story already, but then during the debriefing we heard more, where our observers remarked that the experience of voting was in many cases very different across the areas where they observed. And this is both across the different constituencies, where the returning officers may have issued sometimes different guidance where it comes to implementation of some of the procedures, but also across different polling stations. So where, you know, the presiding officers and election clerks would differ in the way they implement it. And for instance, the division of tasks among the clerks, the stage at which the ID is checked in the process, and several others. So we saw quite a bit of that, quite a bit of inconsistency overall, with a high degree of variation and even inconsistency, if you will. But noted that these aspects did not greatly impinge on the quality or the integrity of the process overall. I'm not sure if my colleagues want to add, but I would finish with that.
Maybe just very briefly to add to that, because I think we comment on this in the report, that the main rules are there in the law and they have to be adhered to, obviously. So there are certain procedures in place which cannot be departed from, and this we have definitely observed. There is some room for organizing things differently in polling stations as it happens, and without departing from the main procedures that need to be in place. And that's where the guidance from the Election Commission is obviously key. But it's just that, it's guidance, it's not binding. So the Election Commission does provide very detailed instructions that may or may not be taken up by the returning officers.
Ian, hopefully that's covered the point. I remember myself seeing this and thinking there was a kind of balance between flexibility and consistency. Honourable Amolo, was that your experience of the mission as well?
Well, yes. I think our colleagues Vasil and Stefan have covered it well, but that really was the thing. There was especially discretion when it came to observers. While observers were well accepted and well treated, but the means and mode of welcoming observers and treating them seems to be at the discretion entirely of the returning officer. And we thought that that's one of the areas that needs to be tightened in terms of, you know, when the observer comes in, you record, and, you know, and all the other things that go with it. But I associate myself with the answers from our colleagues.
Thank you. Yes, there may be something about observation more generally, and how observers are invited, and how, you know, how that works, that we could talk about later. But I also know that Martin, assuming the internet with Lesotho is working well, that Senator Motsamai might be online with a question. Is that possible?
He would need to make himself known in the chat. I'm not sure if he has managed to join. So maybe right now, maybe we dive into some of the questions that those quick off the mark have got in already. So I mean, the first one that's come in, Vasil will be glad to see, is about the legal system in the UK, asking if there are any domestic laws relevant to the election and broader democratic environment that didn't align with international law. I mean, maybe Vasil, do you want to dive us into that, and feel free to relate it to our recommendation on the legal framework if you wish.
Thank you for that question. We were fortunate enough to be able to lean on the Law Commission's report when it came to the analysis of the legal framework. Obviously, the legal framework is vast, and there are many aspects of it that one could comment on in more detail. We did comment on some of the aspects that we thought were most relevant for us and to our findings as they were from this very short period, as we have explained during the pre-election stage of the mission. So you will find some references to international standards in the report, and also to importantly to what is a good electoral practice. For example, when it comes to carrying out delimitation of boundaries, where we talk about constituency boundaries finally being in place for this election, but this is after a rather long break, and that break, for example, is much longer than it is common in international practice. So the short answer is yes, we do make some comments on certain aspects, but of course this is not a report that goes into a detailed analysis of and comprehensive analysis of the entire legal framework of the UK.
Yes, I think there may even be suggestions that there will be more electoral reform brought forward by this government. So obviously we will feed our report into any of that work. Hopefully it will support them in their deliberations. Martin, I can see that there's a question from John Alt in the Q&A around ID cards. I remember before we set up this mission, we were quite interested in the impact of ID cards being used. It's slightly different to John's question, but I might just pose this one, particularly to the Honourable Amolo, where I know there's lots of countries that use ID cards, and there was a bit of surprise about the UK requiring ID, which is kind of normal practice in other places. But I wondered if either any of our panelists would like to comment on ID and how that played out in our assessment, because it was something unusual of this election.
I could give it a first go. First,
please.
During the interactions before the elections day, I think the use of IDs was highlighted as a danger to the success of the elections, being that it was the first time that it was going to be used. And some of us as observers were quite concerned as to how it would play out. But ultimately, our observation was that it was not as serious as it was thought. It turned out that there's hardly any notable number of voters who turned out, hardly notable number who were turned out on account of their ID. Because as it were, we observed that the identification was accepted at so many levels. There were so many different documents that you could use for identification. I think in some of this, in one station with my colleagues, we counted that they had allowed up to nine or 10 different IDs, from national ID to passport to driving license to all sorts of other, that provided it had an image of the voter. And I think that helped the situation. We also noticed that in some instances where a voter did not perhaps have an acceptable ID, they were allowed time to go back and get an acceptable ID and come back. So in our view, although it was the first time the ID was being used, it did not turn out to be a problem as some people had feared.
Yes, I think we definitely saw that lots of people were turning up with their ID. But Stefan, do you want to comment on the use of ID a little bit, because I know that there were conversations as well about how it might put people off, and that's a little bit harder to count or observe the people who don't come to the polling station.
Sorry. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the issue there, I think, is the fact that we know the information, and the Electoral Commission itself collects some of this data through some of the forms that the election clerks fill out and collect that data, and this is something that is observable. What is a little bit more problematic, of course, is when the greeters outside the polling stations already turn the voters away. So that becomes a little bit more difficult, whether people have shown up with the right ID or not. So that data becomes a little bit more difficult to collect. And that's one of the issues that I think need to be examined a little bit more cautiously. The exercise that is being run by the Electoral Commission is very good at collecting information once you are in the polling station, where some of the data can be collected. But what happens outside, whether some people are already turned away by the greeters, may be a little bit more difficult to capture. And that's something that I think would have to be looked at. Overall, there's an ongoing discussion. I think from the Electoral Commission itself, it seems to me that there is going to be a review. There may be a review already ongoing of the kinds of documents that are acceptable as forms of ID. That list of acceptable IDs may be widened to include other documents, perhaps remove some of the inconsistencies. So I think it's important to stress that it is an ongoing process, that this is still being assessed by the authorities, by the Electoral Commission itself, and we may see some tweaks and changes in the future that may make this perhaps a less of an issue in the future.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I got the impression throughout our work that constant improvement was the order of the day, and hopefully our report and its recommendations feed into that. Martin, were there other questions in the Q&A that you would flag for the panel you've been keeping up with?
Yes, and I must say we probably won't have time to answer every question, so we will share an email address in the chat before the end of this seminar where you can follow up with us if we don't have time to do your question justice. I wonder if maybe we take the next two questions that you might kind of look at under the theme of diversity and inclusion. So one is from Jeremy Balfour from the Scottish Parliament, who asks if any work was done around disability in terms of the number of candidates standing and issues with voting for those with disabilities. And secondly, Ina Gardner, who's joining us from the States Assembly in Jersey, in terms of the representation of ethnic minorities during this election and looking at previous ones. Possibly, Stefan, do you want to take the lead on starting the response there?
Sure, maybe I'll take Ina's question, and if okay, Vaso, would you mind taking the disability question? Would that be all right? Yeah. So in terms of the diversity and inclusion, you know, again, we've already talked about women, and you know, we have this paradox there. So we have the highest number of women overall standing, not the highest share, you know, and then we really have to look at the reality of sort of the nomination process and how parties nominate it. And the variation there among the political parties. And we can celebrate the fact that so many women were elected, 40+% of the new legislature is composed of women MPs. Again, that's to some extent down to the fact that it's the Labour Party that won and has had the most diverse group of candidates standing in these elections. So again, kind of a cautious celebration, because that doesn't necessarily follow that these gains for women representation can be sustained over time. I think the same is true of other forms of diversity and inclusion. So whether it be ethnic minorities, LGBT communities, and so forth. You know, two caveats. One is because the data is not collected, there isn't necessarily one source to go to obtain that information reliably. The second caveat, of course, again, we don't compare to previous elections, so we wouldn't have necessarily looked at the figures from 2019. Although, as I've already said, the number of women is higher than we've had in previous elections. There seems to be a suggestion that the number of candidates representing ethnic minorities, and again, data is not collected in a way that allows us to make this kind of as a firm statement, but appears to have been higher in these elections than any of the previous ones. That's likely supported also by the fact that we have had the highest number of candidates standing for UK elections ever. So that's bound to be the case overall. Whether they're also the highest share of ethnic minorities among those candidates, that stands to be perhaps studied more closely. What we do know is that the emerging parliament, the parliament that emerged, that was returned to the 4th July elections, is more ethnically diverse and has the higher female women representation than in the previous elections. So this is something we can already see also in some of the news reports. There's been a figure thrown around of around 13% of the House of Commons membership of being made up of Black, Asian, and ethnic minority lawmakers. That's up from something around 10%, I believe, in 2019. So we can celebrate a more diverse body. Again, this data is problematic insofar that we don't know how many candidates, because that data is not available centrally. And again, we make that kind of recommendation. It would be helpful to have some of that information. And of course, the caveat that we're still not sort of at what you would expect that figure to be, because in a general population, the presence of Black, Asian, or minority population is still higher, close to 20%, or just under 20%. And I'll pass on the button maybe to Vasil for the disability question, if that's all right.
Thank you. Just very briefly, because I see that we are definitely running over time. One finding that we do have from election day is we have asked the observers to keep an eye of accessibility of polling stations for voters with reduced mobility. And over 90%, 92% of the locations they have visited were in fact accessible for voters with reduced mobility, which we thought was a good result. We also saw in the similar number of polling stations, again, over 90%, that there were aids for voters with visual impairments, which is also excellent finding, and I think all of us were pleased with that. The caveat there is perhaps that some of the meetings that we have held with organizations for people with disabilities before the election seem to suggest that the voters themselves are not always aware that this is out there, that this is available for them in polling stations. So if that is the case, then of course this still leaves room for informing the voters of what sort of assistance they may expect.
So maybe just one thing to add. We have also noted that in previous elections, there have been facilities, financial facilities, programs available to candidates with disabilities that would allow them to engage in campaigning and so forth. A provision that was not available, perhaps largely down to the fact that the elections took place on such a short notice, but also something to think about, perhaps with a view to future elections. That we have heard. We haven't done this in a sufficiently comprehensive manner, perhaps to issue a recommendation, but we have heard that the facility was available for candidates with disabilities, persons with disabilities in the past, to make campaigning a little bit easier for them.
Thank you. And I'm conscious of time. We've got about 5 minutes left. I can see that our Deputy Head of Mission, the Honourable Ryan Callis, has asked a question about postal voting and the problems there. The question seems to be whether we already know of any changes in the system. I don't think I can remember if it's quite reached that point in the cycle as in terms of next steps that we've heard. It was more what we'd observed, but it was a good point on postal voting, which we talked about earlier with our recommendations. So I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add on the specifics of postal voting change or issues of that the Honourable Callis has raised. Vasil.
Nothing much to add, to be honest. We had the discussion during the mission that we would very much look forward to hear what proposals will emerge of the reform. There's quite a lot of discussions about further reform. So we do hope that our recommendations will be there on the table when this is considered, especially since we're adding our voice to the other voices that have said there are issues that need to be discussed in relation to postal voting. The current situation is just not sustainable for the amount of the requests that are coming in, the amount of applications that need to be processed, and during this very short period of time that there is for postal voting. So we hope this will be further taken up in the reform discussions.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to use Chair's prerogative to pick up on a point that the Honourable Omolo made about observers and inviting observers in and training for presiding officers on managing observers. Stefan or Vasil, would you like to say anything more? We did make a recommendation about observers. I know we've got some other observers online as well about how observers can be involved in future elections and what we might do about that. Stefan, perhaps over to you first.
Yes, of course, sure. This is really about two aspects for us. So first, we are generally like to see a kind of an open invitation for observers to observe all aspects of the process, to make no kind of limitation. And in the UK, law is specific about parts of the process that are accessible to observers, where observers may observe. And we thought that in the interest of transparency, in our view, this should be revised to become a more kind of inclusive process, wider observation of all stages. So rather than restrict it to some stages of the process, to make this, to revise those provisions, to make all parts of the process accessible and observable to observers without that limitation. And the second, we received kind of a different level of recognition from polling station staff where we observed. So I think one of the things that really sprung up to me is that when we debriefed, and we ourselves, having visited a few polling stations, saw this ourselves firsthand, is that the polling station staff, while there was no hostility, many poll workers simply did not know who we are or what we do. And we thought that in the interest of making us more familiar to the polling staff, to the process itself, there is some room for awareness raising and perhaps training of polling staff on the role of observers and what we may or may not do. We saw some deficits there that could be also fulfilled. There's also been a sort of a side comment from some of the observer groups, whether the way that observer groups are invited to the UK or accredited to observe in the UK, that perhaps there could be an outgoing invitation also to some of the groups, particularly when it comes to some of the international organizations, where perhaps they feel that they would like to be invited to observe rather than seek accreditation on their own account. I'm not sure if you want to come in on that, Sarah, with more detail, but that's one of the remarks we've also made in the report.
Thank you. And hopefully us talking about ourselves isn't indicative of the importance we give to that, but actually the overall report, I hope you'll find, and I hope you'll take time to read, the link is in the chat, is a balanced suggestion of all the things that we saw over that period of time of the observation. And I think it remains for me to thank everybody who was involved in the setting up of the election assessment mission, all of the observers who travelled from across the globe to be with us and give their time and their opinions. It was a truly valuable experience on many levels for us, and we really appreciate it. I'd like to thank both of our experts, Vasil and Stefan, for your professional advice, and to our Deputy Head of Mission, Ryan Callis, and our Head of Mission, the Honourable Otiende Omolo, for leading this mission and helping us to produce the report, and to Martin and all the team at CPA UK who worked on this over many weeks and put it together. We're really hoping it genuinely is a useful and interesting snapshot of the UK election and things that could help the UK elections improve in 5 years' time. And you'd all be very welcome to join us again, hopefully, for another successful election assessment mission in the future. But thank you for your time today, and thank you for everybody for participating. There's also contact information in the chat. So if we haven't answered your question, if we haven't dealt with the issue, do get in touch with us. This is a topic we're going to carry on working on. So we'd really look forward to hearing from you. So thank you very much, everybody.